Hello, my name is Michas, and I'm going to do my presentation. It's called The Gray Area, the Rejection of the Psychedelic and Spiritual in Contemporary Art. The basic structure of my presentation, I'm going to start with some general themes in 20th century art history, and then I'll talk about how spiritual and psychedelic art have been received in academia, or really not received at all in academia. Then I'll apply my research to a particular case, the art of Alex Gray, and I've selected him for a number of reasons. First of all, he's very popular. Even if you don't know him by name, you've probably been exposed to some of his artwork before because he's just all over the place. He's also a highly skilled painter, and also is critiqued largely for his unabashedly spiritual and psychedelic themes. And I just do this. And here's some quintessential Alex Gray imagery right here. He's a self-proclaimed psychedelic painter who is part of both the Western entheogenic tradition and New Age movement. An established artist with a strong subcultural following, he is somewhat of an anomaly in the contemporary art world and is often met with a critical reception around highbrow academic articles in newspapers. And as an individual case study, Gray's content and its subsequent response shed an intriguing light on the prohibitive and limiting currents underlying contemporary art criticism. His work embodies a unique amalgamation of postmodern artistic taboos, since he's both a psychedelic painter and spiritual artist. His paintings are immediately reminiscent of the organic ebbs and flow in color and form found in the posters of Summer of Love and rave culture. He boldly proclaims his religious agenda in a treatise which he wrote, which is called The Mission of Art, and it calls for the resacralization of art to fill a spiritual deficit left in the contemporary art market. Both psychedelic and spiritual traditions have either been diminished or entirely omitted from the prevailing art historical narrative, despite their prevalence and influence throughout the 20th century. While psychedelic and spiritual elements in Gray's work are deeply enmeshed, the two genres have distinct historical trajectories that periodically intersect. So now I'm just going to explain the difference in definitions between psychedelic and spiritual artists. And first I'm going to quote from the catalog Summer of Love, which was an exhibition done in London in the Tate Modern about 2005. And it defines the psychedelic artist as an artist whose work has been significantly influenced by the psychedelic experience and who acknowledges the impact of the experience on their work. And while there's no strict time frame to include all possible candidates for this definition, the term was first coined in 1957 by Humphrey Osmond and then used extensively throughout the 60s and 70s. The term spiritual artist is perhaps more problematic since its connotations vary greatly, but for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to borrow a definition used by an art critic, James Elkins, who I actually go on to kind of criticize a lot of in my presentation, who says that this is art that's based upon, quote, any system of belief that is private, subjective, largely or wholly incommunicable, and can be part of religion. So this is art that conveys a mystical experience in its most direct sense, without the postmodern filters of irony, scandal, and humor. While the psychedelic and spiritual genres may overlap, they are still distinctly separate categories because psychedelic art does not all convey a religious message, and spiritual art is certainly not all derived from psychedelic encounters. However, the similarity that these genres share as rejected art forms reveals an intriguing parallels that indicate a deeper reaction endemic in the Western art world. Art from both genres are popular and widely reproduced. The term psychedelic has become a marketing staple in poster and album sales, and a recent international competition, not so recent, it was the year 2000, for a contemporary version of Jesus, drew in thousands and thousands of applications. So there's still a thirst in the public for this style of art. But to say that it's the popularity of this art that's offending the elitist critics is just scratching the surface. Both genres share the fundamental motivation to convey an interior experience that transcends the self-conscious exercise of art for art's sake. The term art for art's sake is totally art history 101. It's used to refer to a modern concept that stresses a painting's self-reliance, and that art is, from the 20th century, is only informed by aesthetic principles versus spiritual ones. Psychedelic and spiritual art have been marginalized due to a postmodern reaction that condemns, quote, the duplicitous arts of illusion, which were cast out along with the spiritual, the heroic, the mythic, the expressionistic, the personal, and any other meaning-generating condition. Instead, the cool conceptualism of the 1960s versus the wildly colorful psychedelic art is emphasized in art history, mostly due to the movement's phenomenological and epistemological inquiries, which are viewed as highly relevant today. Psychedelic and contemporary spiritual art remain on the periphery because they are experientially versus theoretically based. And while their historical participation still remains largely unsung by scholars, they continue to be embraced by the general public. So here I have an image of Frank Stella done in 1959. This is sort of what I was saying, these kind of images are selected more over this very, very groundbreaking Klarwein done in 1961 of the Annunciation scene. One movement is sort of preferred over the other by people who are recording art history. So this is just a brief history of LSD before the 1960s. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this. Accidentally ingested by Albert Hofmann in 1938. Then used by Humphrey Osmond, a psychiatrist, to see its therapeutic effects on the treatment of alcoholics. Then Huxley wrote Doors of Perception after he took a heavy dose. And then finally, the 60s happened. Psychedelic and spiritual art have been, oops, I did that one. Oh, the political climate of the 1960s provided an ideal audience for LSD, and the drug became a prevalent theme in the music and art of the decade, where happenings, light projection art, and colorful paintings dominated the cultural scene. Psychedelics became deeply enmeshed in popular culture where the success of hippies in comparison to other more voluntaristically politicized countercultures was in no small measure caused by a strategic advantage. One had available a special form of quasi-physical knowledge gained through profound experiences and not just intellectual insights. I love this quotation. However, emphasizing the direct and sensorial experience of LSD's role in art affected its legitimacy and reception in academia. Modern scholarship in art history has selectively emphasized conceptually inclined movements such as pop and minimalism over the psychedelic. Ken Johnson, an art journalist for the New York Times, has stated that, quote, a well-kept secret of the mainstream art world is the role that psychedelic drugs have played in shaping and altering the course of art since the 1960s. The story of contemporary art and the psychedelic revolution remains to be told. So, while psychedelic visual art spans a variety of media, from painting to sculpture, there are specific distinguishing characteristics. It is an anti-academic movement that has been compared with other currents in art history that initially suffered similar scholarly rejection, such as Rococo, Pre-Raphaelite, and Art Nouveau. What is common in all these genres is that they are highly stylistic, embracing, quote, complexity over simplicity, pattern over form, repetition over composition, feminine over masculine, curvilinear over rectilinear, and the chaotic over Euclidean order. And in this slide, I've just taken, this is sort of the cover of an Art Nouveau novel, and I've compared it to a poster during the psychedelic era. I mean, you can see all the visual similarities that they're drawing from there. I mean, this should be sort of another field explored, Art Nouveau versus psychedelic art, because they seem to pick on a lot of the same subject matter. Indeed, art movements that emphasize these traits are often considered superficial by intellectual standards, since they focus on design, despite their great influence on high aesthetics. Traditional scholarly opinion has deemed decorative arts as useless ornamentalism that is not academically or politically topical, and indulges sensory stimulation over theoretical discourse. Perhaps this is what gives psychedelic art such a democratic appeal, since its visual impact is emphasized over its intellectual comprehension. While psychedelic art is commonly conceived as a 60s phenomenon, the style makes periodic comebacks and has become a bad dream that won't go away for art scholarship. Indeed, there are a number of prominent figures since the 1960s who have attributed the experience of LSD as a primary influence of their work, such as the late Keith Haring, who was one of the most successful artists of the 1980s. Despite psychedelic art's continual resurgence, it is curious why scholars and critics keep turning a blind eye to its significance. One approach to this question investigates the clash in personae between the image of the psychedelic artist compared to the ideal of the postmodern one espoused by the art market. Susie Gablick, a scholar, I've got a little picture of her up there, has dealt with this theme extensively and notes that the contemporary artist is, quote, the model of the egocentric, separative self whose perfection lies in absolute independence from the world, impervious to the influence of others, and I would like to add, impervious to the influence of other states of consciousness. This extreme independence promoted by the mythic postmodern artist runs counter to how psychedelic artists typically portray themselves in their inspiration. They achieve direct influence from an external source, which is a drug, and typically advocate social activism and global consciousness. These notions, quote, informed an art about the disintegration of barriers separating the exalted artist from his or her audience, providing yet another source for the democratic character and popularity of psychedelic art. The image of the psychedelic artist who relies on inspiration from drug experiences, quote, elevates concepts of externalized consciousness over constructions of alienated interior self. So, one of the greatest mythologies in art history is that modern art is entirely secular and only informed by aesthetic versus spiritual principles. This early narrative was initially proposed by Alfred Barr, the first director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. He viewed modern art as a formal progression from the tired religious and genre paintings of the 19th century. While it is true that many fin de siècle impressionists painted bourgeois urban life without the least hint of spiritual inquiry, many of their contemporaries were highly influenced by both orthodox and esoteric spirituality. Here I have a painting by Caillebotte, one of the few impressionists I can stomach. And this is just sort of what you were seeing at the turn of the century, just urban life being portrayed, the character of a flaneur walking around the city, painting what he saw. Or if you were a woman, you were kept in your house and you painted stupid little kittens in baskets or children. And that's pretty much Impressionist art, according to me. And so now I've taken Alfred Barr's model and I've sort of injected some of the artists I've touched on as actually having much more of a spiritual background than how they're typically portrayed. And just showing you that maybe not all artists from the modern era were spiritual, but a lot of key players actually were. And their art went on to inspire maybe even the ones who were more secular. So the forefathers of abstract art, Kandinsky and Mondrian, were known to follow the theosophical works of Blavatsky, Besson, and Ledbetter. Kandinsky even directly proclaimed his objective in his treatise concerning the spiritual in art. Recent scholarship has also examined the spiritual motivations of Van Gogh and Gauguin, who were deeply rooted in religious thought. For example, Mondrian, who's sort of looked at as, just very minimalist, putting lines and colors together. He was a follower of theosophy, so all these colors had spiritual meaning to them, and their ordering was kind of showing sort of esoteric system of how the universe and how he's basically portraying some very esoteric ideas, but that's sort of not how you're taught him initially. And there's a lot of great scholarship just in this area that's really just sort of not as well dispersed as it should be. Despite an abundance of evidence that many key modern artists intended their work to have spiritual meaning instead of solely being art for art's sake, critics and professors like James Elkins sweepingly dismissed this informed alternative by proclaiming that, quote, art that sets out to convey spiritual values goes against the grain of the history of modernism. By selectively interpreting only the formal aspects of modern artists, contemporary critics and historians have projected and affirmed their own self-serving agenda. That's James Elkins over here. I've singled him out for two reasons. He's written a book basically on this subject matter where I'm taking all these quotations from, called On the Strange Place of Religion in Contemporary Art. And he's also a professor at a major art school in America. So he's just very influential in this field, and this is sort of his orientation. Elkins recounts the story of how he helped judge a religious art contest that mostly selected humorous and questioning works. The judges reviewed one submission of a painting that they all enjoyed at first because it reminded them of work by Georgia O'Keeffe, who's an abstract expressionist. Upon reading the intention of the artist, they immediately rejected her painting. Quote, I am a monk from the closed order of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. These pictures are my meditation on God. Apparently, the monk was not catering to the postmodern sensibility of these art critics, who require the artist to be adamantly separate from their religious subject in order to qualify as a candidate. On these grounds, they rejected the work, even though the monk seemed to prove herself initially as a worthy artist. Despite the strong bias in the art world that, quote, modern spirituality and contemporary art are rum companions, spiritual art is ubiquitous. The term spiritual art ranges across a variety of media and spectrum of quality, and while there are artists like Alex Gray who have required rigorous fine arts training, the most widely reproduced spiritual works tend to be a bit kitschy and derivative images, such as the sentimental Jesus painting done by Warner Salmon in the 1940s. And this is one of the most reproduced paintings in the world, like up there with the Mona Lisa. In sum, while there is a predominance of spiritual imagery that could be considered kitsch or lower work, there's a suspicious compulsion in the current art world to relegate all spiritual works to this category. And this is James Elkin, I'm quoting again. Most religious art, I'm saying this bluntly here because it needs to be said, is just bad art. Virtually all religious art made for home and churches is poor and out of touch. Art that is explicitly spiritual has been marginalized in the contemporary art market and is generally unrepresented in museums, unless it makes a subversive statement or is clearly undecided and suspicious. While many postmodern artists have dealt with religious subject matter, such as Serrano's infamous Piss Christ, which is a plastic crucifix in a vat of the artist's urine, and then he has a photograph, or this one over here, which was displayed in New York during the 90s, and it's the Holy Virgin Mary. She's made out of cow dung, and there are all these little pornographic butts everywhere. That's it. They replace emotional expression with a humorous or scandalous statement that distances the art from personal involvement. Even if a spiritual artist does not refer to a figurative religious theme, such as the monk I just mentioned, they acknowledge a spiritual experience that inspired their work, and have therefore felt involved with something greater or outside themselves. Elkins describes how he and other professors approach spiritual works done by students. And there's his quote right here. The work's religious meaning is ignored or written off as something so personal it cannot be addressed. This statement, which was made by a critic who defends the postmodern paradigm, presents an interesting paradox. The work of a postmodern artist must be individualistic, but not too personal. This may account for the squeamishness displayed by art critics when critiquing a deeply personal work that engages religious themes or simply conveys a subjective spiritual experience. And this is the mastering studio. The trajectory of Gray's art is marked by key psychedelic experiences that inspired some major artistic directions as well as personal development. Born in 1955, Mr. Gray was exposed to the peaks of the psychedelic movement. He recalls writing a report on LSD in the 7th grade after he read a Life magazine article. Seduced by the coolness of Timothy Leary, Gray remembers that back then, quote, LSD was legal and the visionary and therapeutic cosmic consciousness aspect of the drug was emphasized. Gray's initial impression of LSD was informed by Leary's sacred and uplifting model, and Gray continues to view the drug as a spiritual vehicle. Within the scope of his work, the character of his art changes after 1975, when he first experimented with the entheogen. Gray recounts this revelation in his book Transfigurations after struggling with the metaphysical impasse of the duality of life and death, both in his work and in his personal life. Gray recounts having petitioned a higher power to aid him in transcending his spiritual dilemma. He believes his prayer was answered when he tried LSD for the first time while meeting his future wife, Allison, and indeed both experiences majorly impacted his work. While on the drug, Gray had a vision of both black and white spirals, a visual duality coming together of one, and this inspired the idea that dualities such as materialism versus ethereality can be overcome through integration. Further experimentation with LSD, along with collaborative work with Allison, would inspire Gray's pinnacle series, Sacred Mirrors. While ingesting LSD, the couple placed blindfolds over their eyes in order to explore how the drug would interact with sensory deprivation. They both recorded a similar experience. A fountain of light was flowing through them. This vision was specifically depicted in this piece, Universal Mind Lattice, and expanded upon in the 20 other paintings of his series, Sacred Mirrors. These are just a few of the pieces that I've picked. Upon outlining the similarities and critical reception of both psychedelic and spiritual art movements, one can detect an underlying orthodoxy in the art world today, especially concerning the response to Alex Gray's work. This is not a matter of coming to his defense as an individual artist, but investigating what he symbolizes to critics by including two historically rejected art forms. It is the blanket uniformity of this criticism that draws suspicion, not its individual application to one person's work. A number of journals have commented on Sacred Mirrors, and Gray generally receives positive reviews from alternative and popular forums such as High Times and the Village Voice. However, critics from more highbrow sources such as the New York Times and Art Forum seem to be almost unnerved by his explicitly religious subject matter, appeal to popular culture, as well as his departure from the secular white cube display space that is so typical in art galleries. The formal aspects of Gray's work, such as his use of color and decoration, are immediately reminiscent of psychedelic art. In Sacred Mirrors, the first series of physical systems, these first two over here, are depicted with sheer realism, while his energetic models, these two right here, portray a dominant patterning motif. In his psychic energy systems, the entire canvas is filled with a rhythmic depiction of an invisible system that kind of looks like an electrical storm. Psychedelic artists of the 60s were notorious for emphasizing pattern throughout their entire composition, and this technique visually depicts the experience of an inherent oneness of everything that so many entheogen users report feeling. In the context of this series, these paintings are completely energized by bright contrasting colors that fill the entire space. Gray was inspired to use a blue color scheme from the famous clairvoyant Ledbetter, who believed that blue indicates the highest level of spirituality. Gray also uses a similar palette to previous psychedelic artists in order to engender a visceral response from the viewer. One of the principal discoveries of the psychedelic era was that when two colors of equal value, such as red and blue, are placed next to each other, an optical flicker is generated along the lines where their edges meet. Gray utilizes this visual device by juxtaposing deep blues and reds, first in the body's own circulation system, and then along the body's outline with the blue background. So when you look, these things are sort of life-size, and you look at them, they just kind of cause this sort of flickering effect with your own eyes, like a lot of psychedelic art does. Some of Gray's critics have responded to his formal techniques as being too over-the-top, in the same manner that past critics dismissed pre-Raphaelite, Art Nouveau, and Rococo movements. Art that is too decorative and too visual implies that it's not serious. If the impression that one receives from the work is more sensory than intellectual, then it cannot be considered high art by these critics. And this is a piece done by his wife, Allison, and that's Universal Mind Lattice. A writer for Art Forum describes Gray's series as, quote, wildly radiant, intensely detailed, cosmically driven, and eminently laughable. He overexposes to the point of visual exhaustion. Two separate reviewers responded to the detailed complexity of Gray's works, paintings, as being obsessive, thereby implying that its meticulous execution is more compulsive and irrational than thoughtful. While there is a great volume of secular psychedelic art, the formal aspects of the genre, such as its stylistic patterning and its embrace of entheogens, make it an ideal vehicle for spiritual expression. Gray describes his hallucinogenic experience that, quote, seemed as if the real world was an illusory veil now withdrawn, and the energetic scaffolding of causation and creation, the ultimate reality, eternal and infinite, was laid bare before and through us. All polarities were incorporated and transcended without conflict. Gray visually depicts this revelation through bright, rhythmic patterning that dominates the entire canvas. The complex and indecipherable ornamental dominance presents a visual mystique that can be interpreted as veiling a deeper spiritual meaning behind the composition. Eric Davies, a writer for Art Forum, responds bluntly to Gray's art when he says, quote, he is too much of a mystic literalist for his work to ever make it to the walls of the Museum of Contemporary Art. Transcendence, even if it is a trick of immanence, is still taboo. Another journalist for the Boston Phoenix also recognizes Gray as an anomaly. The didactic intention of the Sacred Mirrors is so far out of step with recent and current fashions as to make you wonder whether the artist is serious. These reviews refer to the blatant religious nature of sacred mirrors in critiquing its transcendence and didactic intention that does not question but embraces the sacred. These critics are responding to Gray's complete disregard of postmodern secularism.
You've got 4 more minutes.
Oh, 4 more minutes?
Yeah.
It'll be good.
Sorry?
Yeah.
What's that, Ellen? Sorry?
Critics are also struck by Gray's choice to house his paintings in a self-created chapel versus displaying them in a traditional gallery space. This is a rather unusual move for a contemporary painter, though chapels have been used throughout the 20th century. Upon entering Gray's chapel, oh yeah, here we have the picture, one is immediately struck with the complete decorative scheme of the entire space. It is unlike the typical gallery since the walls are painted red, and every angle displays a decorative motif from Gray's World Soul, which is this kind of weird sculpture he's got in between the paintings. While the contemporary art world is familiar with installation art, this could not be classified as an installation, but as a sacred space. Even in many contemporary installations, such as Olafur Eliasson, who may be credited with some of the most complex and large-scale installations today, pieces are clearly demarcated from the rest of the museum since they are placed within the typical framework of white cubed walls. In the chapel, there's no distinction where the work begins or ends despite the finite borders of the paintings. So this is a picture of Olafur Eliasson, and here you have this whole installation. It's a giant room, but you still have this tendency to kind of put it within the context of that's where the art is and that's where it ends, and this is, I think, what the purpose of this kind of framework of white cubed walls does. A famous example of a modern artist whose work is displayed in the sacred space is the Rothko Chapel in Houston. Viewers are encouraged to pray and meditate on the pews that face the work and display Holy Scripture from major world traditions. Gray follows suit in this perennial approach by also encouraging non-denominational participation in his chapel with paintings that display figures such as Jesus to Avalokiteshvara. Despite its similarities to Gray's chapel, such as the integration of art and space, Rothko is generally secularized in art history and remembered more as a great conceptualist than a spiritual artist. The influential scholar Rosalind Krauss has commented that, quote, "Now we find it indescribably embarrassing to mention art and spiritual in the same sentence." Gray's art has also been scrutinized for its popular appeal. On reviewing the sacred mirrors, Ken Johnson remarked that, quote, "Mr. Gray is an illustrator in the best and frequently lesser sense of the word. The nonprofit chapel derives much of its income from the sales of posters and books reproducing his paintings. The stigma of a popular painter seems to immediately discredit them as serious artists. In the same manner which popular religious contests and mass distribution of psychedelic imagery turns up many noses in the art world, Gray's appeal to alternative and youth culture through inexpensive reproductions of his work is considered distasteful to critics." So we're running out of time. I think I'm just going to skip that slide. Gray's art conveys his personal psychedelic and spiritual experiences, and its formal aspects cater to the experience of the viewer. An author for Art Forum states that despite Gray's expository look, his art is about vision, not theory. This idea establishes a hierarchy embraced by postmodernism that art should stimulate the mind over the senses. Gray's work emphasizes the artist's participation in experiences that are not solely based on the self, such as the consumption of psychedelic and their subsequent revelations. Take one more minute. While there are a number of factors that culminate in the dismissal of psychedelic modern spiritual art, one of the primary reasons for their marginalization is that these arts are personal, experientially based, and do not promote the artist's isolation. Whether Gray is talented enough to be admitted in the MoCA is one thing. The fact that critics are so stunned by his brazen abandonment of everything that postmodernism holds dear is quite another. An admission that one's inspiration comes from a dog is read as disingenuous because the experience is not truly coming from the self alone. For a similar reason, the pursuit of spirituality in contemporary art is viewed as anti-modern because it relies on previous tradition and experiences that extend beyond the self. And we can just end it there. The art gallery that I'm working at has a show of DMT-inspired work, which is really excellent. This artist named Michael Page. So definitely come by. It's free.
Where's that?
It's at White Walls. It's in the Tenderloin.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.